Hey Trail fam, this is What are you doing?
Dude, you ever been to Georgia in March? It's not if it's gonna rain, it's when it's gonna rain.
Hey Trail fam, I'm Coach.
And I'm Mustard Seed, and we're the Trail Guys.
You know, this year in the Southeast has been one of the wettest seasons that we've had in a long time. And as a matter of fact, today has been one of the only days that we've had sunshine for the entire day, or at least just so far. And we at the Trail Guys wanted to take a moment to talk to you a little bit about wet weather hiking.
Whether you're hiking, backpacking, or camping during a rain, after a rain, or in damp conditions in general, it can be aggravating or frustrating and even life-threatening under certain conditions. So we've come up with 10 different tips to help you the next time you're planning and or executing your next wet weather trip.
Our first tip that we have for you is on selecting your outer rain gear. When selecting your outer rain gear, what you want to look for is something that is of course waterproof, but at the same time is breathable, very compactable, and doesn't weigh a whole lot when it's in your pack. When wearing your gear, what you want to make sure that you do is you use what the Trail Guys like to call a shingling method. And what that actually means is, if you think about how the shingles on a house are laid, your lower layers are laid underneath your top layers. And it works the same process, or the same kind of method works also for when you're hiking. You put your uppermost layer on the outside, and as you go down, everything kind of goes underneath. That way, when the water hits your top and it rolls down, there's no way that it can get inside and make any of your underclothing wet. When I selected my outer layer, or especially my jacket, what I looked for was something that was very light, very breathable and all. And one of the biggest functions that I like about this particular jacket, with the exception of course being waterproof and having tight cuffs around my sleeves, was a very big hood over it. As a matter of fact, this hood will go over the front of the bill of my cap in order to allow water to come across and fall straight down without running in my face. Just little things to help you on your hike, because remember, this is your hike. When I went to look for my outer pants to wear, what I looked for was similar characteristics as my jacket. I wanted something that was very lightweight, except it shed water very well. One of the main characteristics that I looked for in my pants was the fact that I wanted a cuff that was tight around my ankle to help with directing water when it got down there. Your outer layer gear is a very personal thing. Mustard Seed and I even have different opinions on the best outer layer gear to get when we hike in the rain. Mustard Seed seems to prefer the brand Frog Togs more so than anything else. Some people have positive opinions about Frog Togs, some have negative opinions, but it works well for Mustard Seed and makes him happy on his hikes. As a matter of fact, he just bought a brand new set of outer gear, both jacket and pants, for somewhere under 30 bucks from one of the big box sporting goods stores. This jacket that I've got here is actually an I-5 apparel jacket that, believe it or not, I got for less than $20. I've yet to try it out, but I've read good reviews on it, and I'm anxious to get this jacket on the trail. So whatever works best for you makes your hike more enjoyable. These seem to work best for us.
So now that you've picked out your outer layer, you want to pick what's going on underneath that outer layer. So for our second major tip, we want to discuss a little bit about what to actually pick. So rather than going for your traditional hiking clothes, something that might hold water and may or may not restrict movability, you want to opt for something that doesn't really hold water, is pretty breathable, and doesn't influence your mobility in any sort of way. We say to stay away from your typical hiking gear because in general it tends to hold water pretty well and doesn't like to dry easily. These are going to be your cottons, your wools, and especially your downs. They do not dry well at all, And if you're in wet weather, you're not going to have the greatest capability to dry it for long periods of time. So we at the Trail Guyz tend to opt for more synthetic materials such as your polyester, your lycra, things like that that tend to dry and are pretty light. We say to go with your more synthetic materials because they are going to be a little bit tighter fitting, not quite so bulky, and they're also not really going to restrict your mobility as you're hiking along, and especially they're not going to restrict any extra mobility that you might lose when you do have on a bulkier outer layer. An added bonus to these type of materials for your underlayers is, to a certain extent, they will help shed some water and not be quite so heavy if they do get wet. Lastly, going back to the shingling that Coach talked about earlier, these materials do tend to shingle a lot easier. You're able to tuck them down, and since they are a little bit tighter fitting, you don't have to worry about them getting all loose and flowy if the wind is blowing. They will hold a little bit tighter and allow your bulkier material to go over it pretty easily.
Okay, so now you're dry. What do we do about our pack? Tip number 3, we're going to talk about the outside of our pack and how to keep it dry. One of the biggest aggravations that you can have is when you get to your campsite and suddenly you find out that everything inside of your pack is soaking wet because you didn't take the proper precaution to get the outside of your pack waterproofed. Okay, so how do we take care of the outside of our pack? Well, in that case, you have plenty of options available to you. Some are very expensive, some not so expensive. You can buy a poncho that you actually wear that can go over your pack. Of course, a lot of upper scale packs these days come with a pack cover, an outer cover. You need to make sure if you use an outer cover that it is waterproof and you take proper precautions and seal your seams if it has such a thing. You need to treat it exactly like you do your tent. Another option, and probably one of the favorite of the Trail Guys because we're very cheap individuals, is we just get a trash bag. We'll just take maybe a lawn and garden trash bag and we'll cut it in a certain way that we can put it over our pack. Do we look like cheapskates going down the trail? Absolutely. Is our stuff just as dry as the guy that spent $200 on a outer pack shell? Absolutely. Okay, so we took care of the back of our pack, but I see a ton of hikers these days that are hiking with a lot of gear on their front. Cameras, they put their cell phones up there, things of that. Don't forget about your electronics that you may have hanging on some front pockets that you've got on your pack. Most packs these days, your belt that goes around also has pockets in there. And a lot of guys will put, and girls, will put very expensive items such as their cell phones, their MP3 players, cameras, things like that down in those pockets. Don't forget that you've got to take precautions for those. One of the easiest precautions that you can take for those front pockets are just simple Ziploc bags. Keep that gear very, very dry. It's there for a reason, and that reason is because it's important to you. You don't want to find it soaking wet and not working later because you got caught in a big downpour.
So we've discussed how to keep the outside of your pack dry. Now we need to keep what's most important, which is going to be on the inside, how to keep it dry when it does get pretty heavy in the rain and if that outer layer does fail. So when you're preparing to go camping, and I do this every time I go camping whether I know it's going to rain or not, I compartmentalize everything I pack, right? So I take what I'm going to pack and I put everything in its own dry bag, whether it's one of these True Blue dry bags from Outdoor Products, whether it's a trash bag or whether it's just a big gallon-sized Ziploc bag. I make sure that everything goes in a bag just in the rare event that the inside of my pack does get wet. So an example of the way I go through and compartmentalize is in a larger bag such as this. I put all my clothes. I'll roll them up, stick them in there, make sure that bag is airtight, stick it down in the bag. Then I go for things like my food, throw it down in its food bag inside of a dry bag, just in the rare event that our food bag is not a dry bag, which it generally is. And then I'll go for like littler things, you know, smaller things, pillow, a blanket, something like that, depending on what it is. And I make sure it goes in its dry bag and it goes in there. Everything is grouped together and put in its own dry bag and then placed in the pack the way it should be. So I like to use these different colored bags and color code everything. That way, in the rare event that it is a downpour and I'm in a hurry to get camp set up, I know if I grab my yellow bag, that's going to be closed and I probably don't want to open that right now. Or if I need to get my food bag up because I'm just fixing to throw down for the night and go to sleep, I'm going to grab my red bag. But once I do that and I have everything color coded and arranged the way I like it, I then take everything and put it in a trash bag. Is that overkill? Probably so. But I've run into many camps that I've gone through and it has poured rain and my dry bag might have a tear in it that I wasn't aware of, or I may not totally seal it up in a hurry, and this extra trash bag just helps further my belief that everything inside is dry.
So you've hiked all day and you did a good job. You're dry. We hoping your pack's dry. You should be if you followed Mustard Seed's tips. Now you've come to the end of your day and you're now looking for your campsite location and where to put your tent for the evening. Tip 5 is going to talk to you a little bit about how to select the best campsite for your night. When we get to our campsite or a potential location of where we want our campsite, the first thing we want to look at is the lay of the land. Does the land seem to slope away, or is it generally a flat area? I'm looking for a flat location, somewhere that does actually still seem to drain pretty well. Try to stay away from low-lying areas, and by all means, don't camp on a hill. One of the first things that I do when I get to an area is I'll take a look and I'll see what has the water done in the past when it's come through here. If it's still raining when you get to camp, of course you're going to be able to tell what the water is going to do, and you don't want to set your tent up in a location where the water is flowing already. But take a look. Generally the ground will let you know what the water has done in the past. Look for an area where there is very little vegetation, where it looks like maybe the water has cut a path through there, maybe some sort of erosion. Look for an area where the pine straw has been pushed away, or if the pine straw is muddy, that could tell you that there is an area where the water actually stands, and that's another location that you don't want to put your tent, even if it is in a generally flat area. Okay, so this is the area that I chose where we are right now. And the reason I chose this area is we do have a little bit of runoff going down to the lake right here, but this is relatively flat even though it is on a rise. Yes, there is a little bit of a hill behind me, but I can see that the water flows off and back behind myself here, or back behind the location where I'm going to put my tent. I feel like this is generally a good location. There are a few roots and all that I'll clear, and sticks and all that I'll clear away when I get ready to put down my ground cloth. But I feel like as far as water is concerned, this is going to be a good location for my tent.
For our 6th tip, we need to back up a little bit. This one actually starts at home. You want to take and set up your tent and go through all the seams and make sure they are sealed off with waterproof sealant. You also want to make sure that you take, and when you set your tent up, spray it down with a water hose. Get inside, make sure you feel around to make sure that no water is getting in at any point. This also goes along with, you need to make sure that you know your tent. Make sure you're not taking a tent that you've never set up before if you know it's going to be raining, or if there's a possibility that it might rain. Remember, you could be setting up in a quick and hurried pace, so make sure you know where each pole is going to go or where that stake needs to be. Now that you've picked your location, you need to lay out your ground cloth. I do this whether it's pouring rain on me right then, or whether there's a chance of rain, or whether I know it's not going to rain. I do this every time. It's called the bathtub method, right? You want to take and lay your ground cloth out, put your tent on top of it, and then roll the edges of your ground cloth back up under your tent. Not all the way to where your tent's hanging off, but just right to the edge. That way, if you are in an area that might cause some drainage, that the water will hit that ground cloth and just go around. And it essentially creates a bowl or a bathtub shape for your tent. Another thing that you might do is you may want to take and actually dig a small trench around your tent. Now, obviously you're not going to do this when you're overnight hiking or backpacking for long distances, because it's just going to take too much time and cost too much energy. But if you're going camping for an evening with the family, you could take and dig out a trench around your tent, kind of going with the lay of the land. That way, if the water does hit, it's going to redirect itself around your tent and keep you all dry. So now that you've picked your location and you think this might be a good one, you've looked at the lay of the land, you think that it might not hold water and that it's going to run off pretty well, you also want to make sure that you're looking up. Make sure that there's no branches that are overhanging that are dead and with the weight of water could be pulled down on top of you. You also want to make sure that there may or may not be a huge amount of foliage up above you. Make sure there's no leaf cover that's going to drip constantly on your tent and could cause a weird water pattern right generally on your tent.
All right, your tent is set up. Your pack and all and your gear is inside your tent. It's dry. Everything is going well. But now guess what? It's time to cook. And you've got a good downpour coming or one that's already taken place. What do? Well, in tip number 7, we want to talk to you about something that's near and dear to the Trail Guyz hearts, and that's carrying a tarp along with you. Okay, so over on the Trail Guyz Instagram page, we asked a question of our Instagram followers of who carried tarps along with them, who didn't, and why. Because there's a big discussion that goes on about people carrying tarps and why a lot of hikers shy away from taking a tarp, or they think that there is too much added weight to override the benefit of, you know, that a tarp will present. The Trail Guyz personally think that carrying a tarp or maybe even multiple tarps is a very good thing. And one of the best reasons that we can come up with is when you are getting ready to begin your cooking, or you're creating a social area at your campsite and all, and let's say that it's drizzling or that you know rain is coming. If you'll take the time, string up a big tarp and all, you now have a great area that's dry, it's out of the weather, and it just presents a good location for you to cook and for you to gather with your friends, talk things over, maybe even have a pack explosion and just take everything out and let some things dry. You can even put your campfire to the side of your tarp. Definitely don't put it underneath, but put it sort of to the side, and that way you can take items put underneath your tarp but close enough to the campfire so that they'll dry out. Things like the jacket that we talked about, things like some of your clothes, and especially your footwear. Okay, so we've gotten to the campsite now and we're setting up our tarp. Generally what Mustard Seed and I will do, one person will set up a tent, the other person will set up a tarp. That way we have a shelter taken care of. As we set up the tarp, things that I am looking for, I'm looking for larger trees that I can take and put my paracord to. It's usually not difficult to find 4 trees where you can put a tarp up. And if you'll use what's called a trucker's hitch, and that's something that we'll explain in a later video on how to use a trucker's hitch knot, you generally can get a good tarp knot and get it very well secured. Another good hitch to use is a taut line hitch. So the next morning, you get up, you've had that coffee, you've had your breakfast, and you're ready to hit the trail. The last thing that we break down at Mustard Seed and I's campsite is our tarp. And the reason being because we want an area that we can gather underneath, that we're out of the weather if need be. And generally what we will do is we shake anything off the tarp, because more times than not there'll be leaves and debris on top of it. We roll it up, rolling the wet side towards the center, and it goes in our pack last. There is another method or to our madness of putting it in our pack last, and that is because if we're on the trail and we come up on another torrential downpour and we need that tarp suddenly, we can reach in our pack, grab it out, and use it at a moment's notice.
You've now got your tarp set up, you've got your tent set up, you've had that dinner, and now it's time for tip number 8. Where to put your gear. Do you put it inside the tent with you? Do you leave it outside? Do you leave it under the tarp? Do you just stick it under a tree? Well, here at the Trail Guyz, we recommend that you do not put it inside the tent with you. Unless you absolutely have to for the setup of your tent, we recommend you keep it outside under a vestibule or under the tarp. The reason we say no gear inside the tent unless it's absolutely necessary is because that wet gear that you're bringing into the tent will affect that dry gear that you're fixing to get out of the tent. It'll also cause some condensation if it starts to dry out or if it gets cool at night, and that could cause some issues for that down sleeping bag that you might be carrying. Where should you put that gear? Well, obviously you've got your food away from the tent in its own dry bag, hung up, strung up, whatever you do. So where should you put that gear? Well, we recommend, if your tent does have a vestibule, we recommend sticking it just outside the tent under that vestibule, so it does semi-stay dry, but it's not inside your tent with you. If you did set up a tarp like we discussed in tip number 7, you could just stick it under the tarp. Now there is the possibility that water could run through, so you may want to make sure that it's up off the ground or that it is waterproofed on the outside. We also recommend that you could take that tarp, if you did not set it up, just take and wrap your bag up in that tarp and stick it against a tree or up off the ground somewhere if you're able. That way no water's just sitting on it, or if the water does hit it, it runs around it. So now tip number 8 we feel is a very important one, because whether you've hiked in the sun all day or whether it is torrentially poured, at night you need to protect that gear from getting it wet, because the next morning you don't want to be getting up having to deal with putting on wet clothes or picking up a wet bag. So even if you've been hiking all day in the sun and you feel like everything's dry, that condensation could still get that gear wet. So make sure you take the necessary precautions, as mentioned before, to keep that gear dry all night.
Everything else is taken care of, but we forgot one of the most important things, and that was taking care of a very important part of your body while you're on the trail: your feet. What footwear should you select in order to hike in wet weather? Should you wear total waterproof boots? Should you wear trail runners? You know, what is going to be the best choice for your trip on the trail? So you've decided that you're going to take a short trip. This is going to be maybe a 2-day trip out on the trail, and there is a suspicion that you're going to have rain. What boots should you wear? Well, the Trail Guyz recommendation is that you wear harder hiking boots, something that is very waterproof. And if you can find gaiters to go around your boots, that's a great option. The thing that gaiters will do is they will go over your boots but underneath your pants to create that great shingle effect that we've talked about before. The waterproof boot will definitely protect your feet. Just one thing to remember: when you get to camp or when you're taking your lunch break, it might be wise to knock that waterproof boot off and let it breathe if you're so inclined and you have the ability to do so. On longer trips, what the Trail Guyz recommend is that you wear trail runners. Yes, we do understand that your feet are probably going to get wet, and we need to just kind of resign ourselves to the fact that trail runners are going to get wet, and on long hiking trips when it's pouring down rain, our feet are going to get wet either way, even if we do have waterproof heavier boots. The reason I recommend trail runners is I will sacrifice a little bit of the comfort and the dryness, or excuse me, of the dryness, in order to have that comfort of the trail runner. A damp sock is going to create a blister just the same as a soaking wet sock. So changing my socks is going to be paramount in either location, or excuse me, in either option, whether it be a waterproof boot or a trail runner. So for my long trips, what I'm recommending are trail runners, and I'm carrying extra pair of socks. Something that is synthetic, like Mustard Seed said before. I stay away from wool, even though that wool will actually help with moisture a little bit. The new synthetics that we've got these days are a fantastic option for helping with water. I also am a very big proponent of wearing 2 pairs of socks, so that the socks will rub against each other rather than the sock rubbing against my feet and creating that blister. As always, make sure that your medical kit has proper ingredients in it for helping with blisters while on the trail. Whichever option that I choose, the main thing that I'm concentrating on when I get to the campsite is doing any and everything that I can in order to help my boots dry out. If I have the option of building a fire, I'm getting my boots close to the fire to try to dry them out. Same thing for my socks. Do I like stinky socks? No, I don't like stinky socks. But at the same time, if I can get them close to that smoke and close to that heat from that fire, I'm going to use it in order to help myself dry those socks and dry those boots out as quick as possible. Keeping your feet dry should be one of your #1 concerns next to hypothermia while you're on the trail.
Alright, Trail fam, you made it to the last trip. So what do we recommend? Well, our last tip and our biggest tip is pre-planning. Make sure that you know what the weather is going to do or what it might do for your next trip. So how do we recommend pre-planning? We recommend pre-planning by constantly checking the weather, constantly checking your map before you go and during your hike. That way you know the terrain, you know which way you're going to go. Are you going to have enough cover? Are you going to need to bring extra cover? That sort of thing. We recommend that you constantly check and recheck everything that's going on around you and constantly keep an eye to the sky. That way you can see if a storm is approaching fast. If the weather does get bad, we recommend you having an emergency plan, an EPA, an emergency action plan. Know where you need to go or where you can go to get out of the weather as fast as possible if something does go awry. We recommend carrying like a GPS unit, maybe a Garmin, maybe carry your iPhone with apps that'll allow you to use offline service, or if you do have service, you can constantly check the weather and check your map. But know where you need to go in the event of an emergency. So lastly, we recommend that if you can and if you feel that it is necessary, get off the trail. I know that might sound like a bit of a oxymoron, but if you do get wet or you do feel like you're in danger or the weather is getting severe and you know you can get off, please get off the trail. Your safety is more important than finishing that hike.
That's it, trail fan. 10 tips straight from the Trail Guys on how you can stay dry when you're on the trail. We hope that these little tips help just a touch when you're out hiking and Mother Nature decides to change your plans on your hike and make it a little wet.
We hope you found these useful and we hope that you enjoyed this video. If we left anything out, drop it in the comments below and don't be afraid to spread your knowledge.
While you're there making a comment, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you feel so inclined, leave us a comment of what you would like to see the Trail Guys cover in a future episode. While you're on the web, check out our Instagram page where we post weekly trail tips and like what you see over there as well.
And as always, we'll see you on down the trail.